My father sent a text message on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. We changed all the locks on the front door and also the gate code. We no longer trust you. I read the glowing words on my screen. I did not panic. I simply typed my reply. Noted. That was clever, but I believe you forgot one thing. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart the people who were supposed to protect you. The midday Austin sun baked the asphalt outside the Lake Travis estate. Heat waves shimmered above the hood of my sedan as I idled in front of the wrought iron gates. I am 33 years old, and I assess corporate risk for a living. As an actuary, I dissect variables, neutralize liabilities, and eliminate blind spots. My daily life revolves around cold numerical logic. I calculate the exact probability of failure and design strategies to prevent it. I reached out the driver's side window and punched the familiar sequence into the metal keypad. A sharp error tone pierced the quiet afternoon. A red light blinked on the panel. The heavy iron bars remained shut. I shifted the car into park and stepped out onto the driveway. The Texas humidity settled over my tailored blazer. I walked toward the pedestrian entrance, inspecting the brass hardware. A new heavy-duty padlock hung from the latch. The metal caught the sunlight gleaming with fresh factory polish. William and Diane, my parents, intended to send a physical message. They wanted me to feel the sting of exclusion. They wanted to prove they held the power. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I retrieved the device. The notification displayed the message from William declaring my exile. I stared at the text. I felt the predictable rhythm of their manipulation, attempting to pull me into a screaming match. They thrived on emotional warfare. I ran my thumb over the cold brass padlock. I did not bang my fists against the iron bars. I unlocked my phone and drafted my crisp response, acknowledging their cleverness and pointing out their singular fatal oversight. I pressed send. A faint smile pulled at the corners of my mouth. I slipped the device back into my pocket, turned around, and climbed into the air-conditioned cabin of my vehicle. I shifted into reverse, steering away from the waterfront property. To understand why my parents locked their own daughter out of a luxury estate, you have to rewind the clock. The seed of this fractured relationship took root 3 weeks earlier. The dining room of that very same lakefront house felt suffocating under the weight of forced pleasantries. William and Diane hosted a catered dinner to celebrate their golden child. My 27-year-old brother, Mason, brought his new husband to the table. Trey sat across from me, presenting an image of quiet wealth. He wore a fine cashmere sweater, despite the southern heat, and an understated Patek Philippe rested on his left wrist. He introduced himself as a venture capitalist. Over poured wine, Trey pitched a concept that would orchestrate their downfall. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany table, ready to sell my parents a dream they could ill afford. 3 weeks prior to the red air light blinking on the gate panel, the dining room of the Lake Travis estate felt like a pressurized cabin. The air was thick with the scent of pan-seared scallops and expensive imported Chardonnay. William and Diane hosted a catered dinner to celebrate their golden child. My 27-year-old brother, Mason, sat near the head of the mahogany table, radiating unearned pride. Mason had never held a steady job. He spent his days in the guest house, painting abstract canvases that remained unsold. Yet, in the eyes of my parents, he could do no wrong. He was the visionary, the creative soul who required constant financial and emotional shielding. Beside him sat his new husband. Trey was 32 years old and constructed a flawless facade of quiet luxury. He was a striking black man who carried himself with the deliberate, measured grace of someone accustomed to boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations. Despite the humid Texas evening, he wore a thin charcoal cashmere sweater. A Patek Philippe Nautilus rested on his left wrist, peeking out from under the soft fabric. The timepiece signaled exceptional wealth without screaming for attention. He introduced himself to our family as an elite venture capitalist, managing a boutique fund based out of San Francisco. I observed Trey throughout the first 2 courses of the meal. My profession trains me to identify anomalies and assess risk. I watched how he interacted with my parents. He possessed a dangerous magnetic charisma. He mirrored William's posture, leaning back when my father leaned back, laughing at the appropriate intervals. He complimented Diane on her taste in interior design, validating the aristocratic image she desperately tried to project. He did not boast about his bank accounts or his assets. He spoke in broad, sweeping concepts about market disruption and identifying holistic value. After the catering staff cleared the porcelain plates, Trey initiated his pitch. He did not pull out a crumpled piece of paper. He retrieved a sleek tablet and slid it across the polished wood. The screen displayed pristine architectural renderings. Trey proposed transforming the aging Lake Travis property into a high-yield luxury wellness retreat. He pointed to the digital images, showcasing infinity pools, built into the limestone cliffs, private meditation pavilions, nestled under the oak trees, and a commercial-grade spa replacing the existing garage. He spoke of targeting high-net-worth clients seeking discreet rehabilitation and exclusive holistic therapies. He promised recurring monthly revenue that would secure the family legacy for generations. William and Diane leaned forward, their eyes tracking the glowing digital renderings. They swallowed the illusion without chewing. I knew the reality of their ledger. My parents were house-rich and cash-poor. They relied on revolving credit lines to maintain their country club memberships and their luxury vehicles. The foundation of their lifestyle was crumbling beneath them. Trey offered them a life raft woven from pure prestige. They looked at the tablet and saw salvation. I looked at the tablet and saw an unmitigated liability. I did not share their blind enthusiasm. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the base of my wineglass. I asked Trey to explain his projected operating cost. I requested a breakdown of the client acquisition strategy. Trey offered a smooth white smile. He kept his voice low and soothing. He stated that the initial modeling was still in the conceptual phase and that visionary projects required fluidity rather than rigid parameters. I did not let him pivot. I pressed harder. I asked him about the Travis County zoning regulations. The estate was zoned for single-family residential use. Converting a waterfront property into a commercial enterprise requires years of litigation, public hearings, and environmental impact studies. I asked him how he intended to secure commercial wastewater permits from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. A commercial spa facility dumping runoff near the lake would trigger immediate federal oversight. The warmth vanished from Trey's eyes. The charismatic mask slipped just enough to reveal the cold operator beneath. He intertwined his fingers, resting his hands on the table. He looked at me with a mixture of amusement and disdain. He patronized me in front of my own family. He stated that my questions were indicative of a rigid corporate mindset. He told the table that actuaries focus on finding reasons why a project will fail, while venture capitalists focus on building the future. He framed my professional expertise as a character flaw, a lack of imagination that kept me tethered to a desk, while real wealth was generated by risk-takers. Mason nodded eagerly, agreeing with his husband. Then Trey revealed the true purpose of the catered dinner. He sprang the trap. He turned his gaze back to me, adopting a tone of collaborative partnership. He explained that to initiate the architectural surveys and secure the zoning variances, he needed an initial commercial development loan. He claimed his venture fund was currently restructuring its liquid assets, preventing him from pulling the cash directly. He asked me to co-sign the loan documents. He framed the request as a mere strategic formality. He stated that adding my pristine corporate credit history to the application would secure a lower interest rate, saving the project thousands of dollars in the long run. He smiled, acting as though he were offering me a privileged seat at a lucrative table. My internal risk indicators flashed bright red. The logic was inherently fractured. Elite venture capitalists managing legitimate funds do not ask actuaries to co-sign initial development loans. A man wearing a watch that retails for more than an average annual salary does not need a sibling to secure a lower interest rate on a preliminary survey loan. The request was a glaring anomaly. It signaled insolvency. I placed my linen napkin on the table next to my plate. I looked directly into Trey's eyes. "No," I said. The single syllable hung in the air, cold and unyielding. The silence stretched across the dining room. William's face turned a deep shade of crimson. He pushed his chair back. The wooden legs scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. He struck the mahogany table with a closed fist. The impact rattled the silverware and tipped a crystal water glass, sending a puddle across the polished wood. He accused me of jealousy. He shouted that I resented Mason for finding love and success. He claimed I was intentionally sabotaging the family future because I preferred to see them struggle. He pointed a shaking finger at me, demanding I support my brother's marriage and invest in the retreat. Diane joined the assault. She did not raise her voice, but her words were designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. She called my pragmatism toxic. She stated that my presence drained the joy from every room I entered. She looked at Trey and apologized for my lack of vision, assuring him that the family stood behind his project regardless of my selfish behavior. I did not engage in the screaming match. Defending reality to people committed to a delusion is a waste of breath. I stood up from the table. I did not offer an apology or a counterargument. I walked away from the dining room, leaving the illusion intact. I stepped into the kitchen. The private catering staff was quietly packing away the prep stations, trying to ignore the shouting echoing from the other room. I approached the head chef. I retrieved my corporate card from my blazer pocket and handed it to him. I paid the entire invoice for the dinner my parents hosted, but could not afford. I added a generous gratuity for their discretion. I walked out the front door and down the driveway toward my vehicle. The humid night air enveloped me. I knew my refusal to co-sign the loan would trigger retaliation. William and Diane required a villain to blame for their financial anxiety, and I had just volunteered for the role. The seeds of my exile were planted in that dining room. 3 weeks later, those seeds blossomed into the brass padlock on the front gate. My parents thought they were punishing me by cutting off my access to the estate. They were oblivious to the fact that I held a trump card that rendered their locks entirely irrelevant. The timeline snaps back to the present hour. I sat in my downtown Austin office. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Texas Capitol, but my attention remained anchored to the dual monitors on my desk. The sterile environment of my high-rise suite provided a sharp contrast to the humid, chaotic atmosphere of the lakefront property I had just left behind. The brass padlock on the gate was a physical manifestation of my parents' ego. They believed they held the ultimate authority. They assumed they possessed the power to dictate who entered their domain. I placed my phone face down on the glass surface of my desk. The text message from my father declaring my exile was still fresh in my digital inbox. I did not feel sorrow. I felt the clinical satisfaction of a mathematician watching an opponent execute a fatal miscalculation. I reached for my wireless mouse. The cursor flashed across the screen. I opened a secure web browser and navigated directly to the Travis County Property Registry. The public database holds the undeniable truth of every parcel of land in the jurisdiction. It strips away the country club facades, and the cocktail party lies, leaving only raw financial data. I typed the address of the Lake Travis estate into the search bar. The system processed the query for a fraction of a second before populating the screen with the official legal profile of the property. The one thing my parents forgot was not a minor emotional oversight. It was a glaring terminal legal reality. To grasp the gravity of their error, you must understand the financial decay hidden beneath their aristocratic lifestyle. 5 years ago, William operated a boutique consulting firm catering to the regional oil and gas sector. The industry shifted. Contracts dried up. The firm collapsed under the weight of its own overhead. Rather than adapt or downsize, William and Diane chose to maintain their illusion of wealth. They continued to lease luxury vehicles. They kept their exclusive memberships active. They funded their lifestyle on a foundation of revolving credit. But waterfront real estate in Texas carries a distinct burden. The property taxes assessed on prime lakefront acreage are exorbitant. When the cash flow evaporated, William simply stopped paying the county. The tax assessor does not care about past prestige or social standing. The delinquency notices began arriving in the mail. The warnings transitioned from polite reminders to bold red final demands. William ignored them all. He locked the letters in a mahogany desk drawer, assuming the problem would somehow resolve itself. He believed his status made him immune to consequence. The county, however, operates on strict statutory timelines. When property taxes remain unpaid, the local government initiates a public auction to recover the deficit. The Lake Travis estate was scheduled to be seized and sold on the courthouse steps. That is when I stepped in. I did not write a check to my father. Handing liquid cash to a sinking man only prolongs his drowning. Instead, I executed a strategic financial maneuver. I attended the county auction quietly and anonymously. I purchased the tax lien certificates out of my own pocket. I paid the outstanding debt directly to the government. The Texas Property Tax Code outlines a very specific protocol for these transactions. When an investor purchases a tax lien, the original homeowner does not instantly lose the property. The law dictates a strict redemption period. The owner is granted a designated window of time to repay the lien holder. That repayment must include the original debt plus a substantial statutory interest rate. If the owner repays the funds, the lien is dissolved. If the owner fails to meet the deadline, the investor holds the legal right to foreclose and take the property outright. For years, I held those certificates in silent reserve. I waited for William or Diane to address the looming threat. I expected a phone call or a frantic request for a loan to clear the lien. The call never came. They lived in blissful, arrogant ignorance. They assumed the county had made a clerical error. They believed the debt had magically evaporated into the Texas heat. They never paid me a single dime. They never even asked about the status of their own deed. The mechanical gears of the legal system do not stop turning just because someone closes their eyes. 6 months ago, the statutory redemption period expired. The clock ran out. My attorney filed the necessary paperwork with the district court. There was no grand trial. There was no dramatic courtroom confrontation. It was a quiet procedural motion handled by a judge reviewing undeniable evidence. The magistrate examined the expired timeline and the unredeemed certificates. The gavel fell. The judge granted me the absolute tax deed. The transfer of title was recorded and finalized. The screen illuminating my office cast a pale blue glow across my face. I stared at the bold text listed under the current ownership profile. My name stood alone. I am the sole undisputed legal owner of the Lake Travis estate. The implications of this document shifted the entire landscape of the conflict. When William sent that text message, he was not a proud father setting boundaries. He was a squatter. When he and Diane installed a new brass padlock on the wrought iron gate, they did not just lock out a skeptical daughter. They committed criminal trespass against the lawful landlord of the property. They illegally restricted my access to an asset I own outright. A standard property owner facing this level of insubordination would reach for the phone immediately. A normal landlord would dial the local sheriff, demand a squad car, and force the squatters off the premises in handcuffs. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, resting my hands on the armrests. I looked at the phone sitting on my desk. I chose not to call the police. Premature intervention is a flaw of the emotional and the weak. If I dispatched law enforcement today, the confrontation would center on a petty lock dispute. My parents would feign ignorance. They would play the victims in front of the responding officers, claiming a misunderstanding over family boundaries. The police would likely treat it as a civil domestic issue, delaying the true reckoning. More importantly, acting now would interrupt the variables currently in motion. Trey is the wild card. He sat at my dining room table, wearing a watch he could not afford, pitching a wellness retreat fueled by borrowed capital. He demanded my signature to secure a commercial development loan. A predator of his caliber does not retreat just because one target says no. He pivots. He finds another angle. If I kick them out today, Trey walks away with a bruised ego, but his operational capacity remains intact. I did not want to merely evict him. I wanted to see the blueprint of his fraud. I needed to know exactly how deep he intended to dig his grave before I buried him in it. I needed him to commit his resources and expose his methods. I closed the county registry tab on my browser. I needed eyes on the property. I needed to monitor the physical space without my physical presence alerting them to my surveillance. The estate borders a neighboring property owned by a retired corporate litigator who travels extensively. I had helped him optimize his risk portfolio a decade ago. I knew his security system covered the shared property line and the main driveway. I opened a new encrypted window and initiated a data request to his network. The quiet war had officially begun, and I was ready to watch my new brother-in-law execute his fatal maneuver. The morning sun bleached the Austin skyline outside my window. I sat at my desk, cradling a ceramic mug of black coffee. My primary monitor displayed a complex actuarial risk model for a corporate client. My secondary monitor displayed a crisp, high-definition video feed. The retired litigator, who owned the property adjacent to mine, utilized a premium surveillance system. His camera angle provided a flawless, unobstructed view of the wrought iron gates and the sweeping circular driveway of the Lake Travis estate. I did not have to wait long for the variables to shift. The morning after my father declared his newfound authority, a convoy of diesel vehicles breached the perimeter. The heavy machinery arrived just past dawn. A fleet of heavy-duty pickup trucks rolled through the open gates. A flatbed trailer carrying a yellow skid steer loader parked directly on the manicured front lawn, tearing deep treads into the imported grass. A crew of contractors wearing high-visibility vests and hard hats swarmed the property. They did not carry tape measures or architectural blueprints. They carried sledgehammers, pry bars, and reciprocating saws. I watched through the digital lens as the destruction commenced. The custom cedar decking that wrapped around the rear of the house was the first casualty. William had spent an entire summer supervising its installation, treating the wood like a sacred artifact. The contractors tore it apart in less than 2 hours. Splintered planks and rusted nails rained down onto the patio. A pair of giant roll-off dumpsters were delivered and dropped onto the concrete driveway with a silent, heavy thud. The crew moved inside the house. I could see the flash of work lights through the floor-to-ceiling living room windows. They were gutting the gourmet kitchen. Chunks of shattered drywall segments of copper plumbing and slabs of crushed granite countertops were hauled out the front door and tossed into the steel bins. Dust plumed into the humid Texas air, coating the remaining landscaping in a fine white powder. An average observer watching this scene would see a family embarking on a bold new business venture. They would assume the ambitious wellness retreat Trey pitched at the dining room table was officially underway. An actuary watching this scene sees something entirely different. I see a ledger bleeding red ink. I watch the foreman coordinate the crew. Premium contractors do not operate on credit. Heavy machinery rentals require substantial upfront deposits. Waste management companies demand immediate payment to drop those industrial dumpsters. Initiating a demolition project of this scale requires tens of thousands of dollars in liquid cash before a single hammer swings. My analytical mind locked onto the stark financial discrepancy. Cash flow requires a source. Mason is a chronically unemployed artist who still relies on my mother to pay his cellular phone bill. His checking account is a barren wasteland. Trey positioned himself as an elite venture capitalist, but his origin story lacked structural integrity. During the dinner, I had mentally cataloged his claims. Elite venture capital firms operate in a highly regulated ecosystem. They leave a dense digital footprint. The previous night, I had accessed the federal regulatory databases, searching for his boutique fund. The system returned 0 results. There were no regulatory filings, no quarterly reports, no registered securities. Trey was a financial ghost. I minimized the security feed and opened a secure proprietary terminal on my primary monitor. Standard internet search engines are designed for public consumption. They filter reality through a lens of curated social media profiles and paid public relations articles. I required raw, unfiltered data. I utilized a specialized corporate intelligence network my firm reserves for vetting international mergers and identifying hostile corporate takeovers. I inputted the legal name Trey provided on his wedding registry, along with his date of birth. I initiated a deep-dive background check, instructing the algorithm to scrape state tax boards' municipal court records and localized business registries across the country. The progress bar ticked across the screen. The system compiled the data, bypassing privacy firewalls and unearthing decades of buried financial history. When the final report populated on my monitor, the results were chilling. Trey did not manage a successful San Francisco boutique fund. He managed a corporate graveyard. The algorithm mapped out a sprawling network of dissolved limited liability companies. His operational footprint spanned across California, Nevada, and Florida. He registered 12 different shell entities over the past 8 years. None of these businesses ever produced a tangible product. None of them filed corporate tax returns beyond their initial year of inception. I opened the individual dockets for each defunct company, tracing the life cycle of his fraud. A distinct, predatory rhythm emerged from the data. Trey operated with the cold precision of a virus. He always targeted a specific demographic. He sought out young, naive partners attached to familial wealth or individuals possessing an unblemished credit profile. He utilized his magnetic charisma and quiet luxury aesthetic to infiltrate their lives. He would establish a legal bond through marriage or formal business partnerships. Once the trust was cemented, he would pitch a visionary startup concept. He would register a shell company and install his target as the primary guarantor. With the corporate entity established, Trey would leverage his partner's pristine credit history to secure substantial business loans, vendor credit lines, and equipment financing. The banks saw the spotless financial record of the victim and approved the capital. The moment the funds hit the domestic accounts, Trey would systematically drain the liquid cash, routing the money into obscured offshore digital wallets. He would bleed the company dry, while his partner remained oblivious. Right before the grace periods expired and the collection agencies began to circle, Trey would dissolve the entity. He would file strategic bankruptcy for his partner, leaving them to absorb the legal fallout, while he vanished into the wind with the stolen capital. I shifted my gaze back to the secondary monitor. The live video feed displayed Trey standing in the driveway. He wore his charcoal cashmere sweater immune to the Texas heat. He held a cup of coffee, pointing at the roofline while speaking to the demolition foreman. He looked every bit the visionary developer. It was a flawless performance. The realization settled in my chest with icy clarity. Trey was not tearing down the cedar deck to build a luxury wellness retreat. The demolition was a smokescreen. When a grifter needs to pacify anxious investors or trick a lender into releasing a secondary wave of funding, they manufacture momentum. They create the illusion of active development. A high-visibility construction project serves as the perfect camouflage. The dumpsters, the heavy machinery, and the dust clouds were all theatrical props. He was putting on a show for an unseen audience, proving that his visionary project was moving forward. It was a tactical distraction designed to keep everyone looking at the flying debris, while he orchestrated a much darker financial extraction in the background. The meticulous nature of his past operations revealed a terrifying truth. To hire this demolition crew and stage this performance, Trey needed initial seed money. The contractors swinging those sledgehammers demanded wired funds. Since Trey was a broke predator and Mason was an empty vessel, the capital had to originate from a secondary source. Trey required a substantial physical anchor to secure the cash for his illusion. The only asset available to him, the only tangible item of value within his immediate reach, was the Lake Travis estate itself. I watched the skid steer loader rip another section of cedar from the foundation. My parents thought they locked me out to protect a brilliant investment. They had actually handed the keys to a parasite who was currently liquidating the very ground beneath their feet. The following morning arrived with a layer of thick humidity settling over the Austin skyline. I sat in my downtown office long before the standard corporate hours began. The silence of the high-rise suite allowed me to focus entirely on the shifting variables of my family dynamic. I was reviewing the overnight security footage from the neighboring camera, observing the idle, heavy machinery parked on my front lawn. The demolition crew had not returned. The dumpsters sat full of shattered drywall and splintered cedar, holding the physical evidence of a staged renovation. My personal cell phone rested on the glass surface of my desk. At exactly 8:15, a distinct chime broke the quiet atmosphere. It was not a text message from William demanding further obedience. It was a priority alert generated by an automated title monitoring service. When I acquired the tax deed for the Lake Travis estate, I installed a digital tripwire. Real estate is a static asset, making it vulnerable to quiet bureaucratic manipulation. A title monitor scans the county clerk databases, scanning for any new encumbrances, liens, or deed transfers associated with a specific parcel number. If a legal document attaches itself to the property, the system triggers an immediate notification. I picked up the device. The screen displayed a stark warning. A new deed of trust had been recorded against my property just minutes prior to the alert. I set the phone down and turned to my primary workstation. I bypassed the public search engines and logged directly into the Travis County Clerk Digital Archive using my professional credentials. I navigated to the real property records and inputted the parcel identification number for the estate. The ledger updated, populating the screen with a fresh entry filed at the opening of the current business day. I downloaded the digitized document and opened the file. It was a commercial promissory note. My eyes scanned the critical data points. The principal sum listed on the loan was $750,000. The originator of the funds was not a traditional banking institution. There was no familiar corporate logo from a national retail bank. The lender was listed as a private equity holding group operating out of a suite in Dallas. Trey had secured a hard money loan. Understanding the mechanics of hard money lending illuminates the exact nature of his strategy. Traditional banks operate on strict regulatory parameters. They require weeks of rigorous underwriting. They demand years of verifiable tax returns, pristine credit scores, and extensive proof of steady income. A man with a graveyard of dissolved shell companies could never survive a standard financial audit. Hard money lenders exist in a parallel financial universe. They do not care about a borrower credit history or their employment status. They care about a single metric, which is the appraised equity of the collateral. They lend cash swiftly, often within a matter of days, rather than months. In exchange for that speed, they charge exorbitant interest rates and impose brutal default penalties. They provide fast liquid capital to high-risk flippers with the underlying expectation that the borrower will fail. When the borrower misses a payment, the lender seizes the asset. Trey needed rapid cash to hire his theatrical demolition crew and sustain his illusion. He found a lender willing to wire $750,000 based entirely on the prime waterfront location of the estate. I leaned back in my chair, analyzing the transaction. A critical logical flaw interrupted the equation. To authorize a lien of this magnitude, the private equity underwriters would pull a standard title report. The report would clearly show that William lost the house. It would display my name as the sole grantee holding the absolute tax deed. William possessed zero legal authority to pledge the dirt he slept on. He could not leverage the estate because he did not own it. Therefore, Trey could not have utilized my father's signature to secure the promissory note. The title company would have rejected the application instantly. I scrolled down the digitized PDF, bypassing the standard indemnification clauses, the default triggers, and the interest rate schedules. I reached the final page of the document. The execution block filled my monitor. I stared at the borrower signature line. Resting above the dotted line was my own name. The cursive ink was fluid, elegant, and terrifyingly precise. I studied the loops of the letters and the distinct slant of the characters. It was a flawless replica of my signature. Trey likely lifted the sample from an old family document left in William's study, or perhaps from the guest book at his own wedding. Beside the forged ink sat a circular blue stamp representing the official seal of a Texas notary public. I traced the edge of my desk with my index finger, letting the reality of the document settle into my mind. The operational sophistication required to execute this maneuver was staggering. Trey did not merely convince a gullible father to sign a bad contract. He engineered a direct bypass of the title verification process. To execute a commercial real estate closing, a notary must verify government-issued identification. Trey did not just forge a signature on a piece of paper. He fabricated a synthetic identity. He either manufactured a fraudulent driver license bearing my name and his accomplice photograph, or he retained a rogue notary willing to stamp documents for a cut of the stolen capital. He assumed my legal persona to strap a massive financial anchor to my sanctuary. He took the cash handed a tiny fraction to the demolition crew to maintain his cover story and kept the remaining hundreds of thousands of dollars for his own obscure purposes. The temperature in my office seemed to drop. The stakes of this conflict shifted instantly. A dispute over a gate code is a petty civil nuisance. Changing locks on a family member is a domestic tantrum. But manufacturing identity documents and forging a signature on a commercial loan crosses a definitive threshold. This was felony identity theft. This was first-degree mortgage fraud. The federal government builds entire task forces to prosecute this specific breed of financial manipulation. Trey proved he was not a lazy opportunist coasting on my brother affection. He was an apex predator who operated without a shred of fear or hesitation. He targeted the estate, assumed the quiet actuary would remain intimidated by the family dynamics, and executed a high-level extraction right under our noses. I closed the PDF file, saving a copy to my encrypted local drive. A standard victim would dial the authorities immediately. Calling the local police would trigger a slow, bureaucratic investigation. Detectives would take weeks to subpoena the notary records and interview the private equity firm. Trey would utilize that delay to route the stolen funds offshore and vanish into the wind, leaving the hard money lender to initiate a hostile foreclosure against my property. I could not afford to let the legal system operate at its standard glacial pace. I needed to confront the predator directly, but I refused to do it on his territory. I needed to look him in the eye and let him know the silent alarm had been tripped. I opened a new tab on my browser, checking the curated social media feeds associated with my parents' country club circle. A man who just stole $750,000 cannot resist the urge to spend a portion of it in public. He needs to project the illusion of success to maintain his cover. I scanned the upcoming events, locating a high society charity gala scheduled for that very evening in downtown Austin. The guest list confirmed my suspicion. Trey and Mason had purchased a premium VIP table. I closed my laptop and stood up from my desk. The time for passive observation was over. I needed to select the right evening gown. I was going to a party, and I intended to deliver a message that no padlock could keep out. The transition from the sterile quiet of my high-rise office to the opulent chaos of downtown Austin required a psychological shift. I did not intend to hide behind a desk while a parasite liquidated my sanctuary. I needed to confront the threat in its own environment. I accessed the curated social media feeds associated with my parents and their country club circle. A man who just secured $750,000 in fraudulent capital cannot resist the urge to spend a portion of it in public. He needs to project the illusion of immense success to maintain his cover story. I scanned the upcoming events and located a high society charity gala scheduled for that very evening at a historic hotel on Congress Avenue. The published guest list confirmed my suspicion. Trey and Mason had purchased a premium VIP table. I closed my laptop and left the office. I returned to my downtown loft and prepared for the evening. Corporate warfare requires impeccable theater. I bypassed my standard tailored business suits and selected a razor-sharp emerald silk evening gown. The fabric draped with flawless precision, projecting an aura of cold, unyielding authority. The color was deliberate. It stood out against the sea of traditional black tuxedos and muted cocktail dresses. I applied a minimalist layer of makeup, focusing on sharp lines rather than soft warmth. I was not attending a party to socialize. I was stepping onto the battlefield, and the gown was my armor. I arrived at the venue just after 8 o'clock. I handed the keys of my sedan to the valet and walked up the marble steps of the historic hotel. The grand ballroom was a sensory overload of wealth and privilege. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of Austin elite. A live jazz quartet played softly in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the roar of overlapping conversations. The air smelled of expensive perfume, roasted tenderloin, and imported champagne. I bypassed the greeting line and navigated the perimeter of the room, my eyes scanning the crowd for my target. I found them holding court near the center of the ballroom. Trey and Mason were stationed at a premium VIP table located mere feet from the primary stage. securing that specific real estate cost, at least $20,000. Trey was utilizing my stolen equity to buy social influence and launder his fraudulent image into high society. He wore a midnight blue velvet dinner jacket, blending seamlessly into the aristocratic environment. Mason stood beside him, holding a crystal flute of champagne, looking radiant and entirely oblivious. My brother played the role of the devoted, supportive spouse, smiling vacantly as Trey orchestrated the room. I watched Trey operate from the shadows of a marble pillar. He was a master of interpersonal manipulation. He shook hands with local politicians. He offered warm, practiced smiles to wealthy widows. He mirrored the body language of every person who approached the table, adjusting his cadence and his vocabulary to match their specific ego. He possessed the terrifying ability to make whoever he was speaking to feel like the most important person in the room. He was building his next roster of victims right in front of my eyes. Patience is a fundamental requirement in risk management. I did not rush forward to cause a scene. Screaming matches in crowded ballrooms only surrender control to the opponent. I waited for the variables to align. After 30 minutes of observing the charade, the opportunity presented itself. Mason leaned in and whispered something into Trey's ear. Trey nodded, offering a warm smile before Mason turned and navigated through the dense crowd toward the open bar across the ballroom. Trey was alone. He checked his patek. Philippe adjusted his cuffs and turned toward the arched glass doors leading to the outdoor terrace. He wanted a moment of quiet, away from the suffocating noise of his own performance. I stepped out from behind the pillar and followed him. The outdoor terrace offered a sharp contrast to the crowded ballroom. The humid Texas night air pressed against my skin. The distant glow of the Austin skyline provided a muted backdrop. The space was mostly empty, save for a few couples conversing in the far corners. Trey walked towards the stone balustrade, resting his hands on the railing and looking out over the city. I walked across the stone patio. The heels of my shoes clicked softly against the pavement, a rhythmic countdown to the confrontation. I stopped 2 feet away from his left shoulder. "Good evening, Trey." He turned his head. The practiced, charismatic smile was already forming on his lips, assuming a wealthy socialite had followed him outside to solicit investment advice. When his eyes registered my face, the smile froze. The muscles in his jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before he reestablished his polished facade. "Harper," he said, his voice smooth and welcoming. "What a pleasant surprise. William and Diane mentioned you were busy with corporate audits. We did not expect to see you tonight." I did not return the greeting. I did not offer polite banter. I looked at the city lights reflecting in his dark eyes and delivered the financial autopsy. "Routing number 063419, I stated, keeping my voice low and devoid of any emotional inflection. "Account number 8824, ending in 71. The originating institution is a private equity holding group based in Dallas. The principal sum is $750,000. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The jazz music drifting from the ballroom felt miles away. I did not stop there. The execution date was yesterday morning at 9:15. The collateral listed on the deed of trust is the Lake Travis estate. The borrower's signature is a flawless forgery of my legal name, validated by a fabricated notary stamp. You manufactured identity documents to bypass the title verification process. The charismatic venture capitalist vanished into the humid night air. The warmth drained from his posture. His eyes went flat and shark-like, stripping away the illusion of the loving husband and the visionary entrepreneur. I watched the cold, calculating operator rise to the surface. A lesser criminal would have panicked. A standard amateur would have stammered, offered a frantic denial, or attempted to blame a rogue business partner. Trey did none of those things. He did not waste breath denying the forgery. He recognized that I possessed the raw data. He evaluated the new parameters of the board and instantly pivoted to offense. He turned his body fully toward me, closing the physical distance. He invaded my personal space, utilizing his height to project physical dominance. "You are a very thorough actuary, Harper," he murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling register. "I respect that. You found the routing numbers faster than I anticipated. But thoroughness is not the same thing as leverage. He reached into the inner pocket of his velvet jacket and extracted a silver cigarette case. He did not open it. He simply turned it over in his hands, a physical prop, to anchor his unyielding calm. Do you know what happens to a corporate risk manager when the state regulatory board receives a detailed, anonymous tip regarding misappropriated client funds? He asked. The threat hung in the air, a precision-guided missile aimed directly at the foundation of my life. I am a venture capitalist, Harper. I build narratives for a living. Trey continued his tone conversational, yet laced with lethal intent. It would take me less than 4 hours to fabricate a flawless digital dossier. I will generate synthetic offshore wire transfers, linking your personal accounts to the corporate reserves of your actuarial firm. I will draft emails that look exactly like they came from your secure server discussing embezzled margins. I will send that dossier to your senior partners, the State Licensing Board, and the Federal Oversight Committee. He took a slow step closer, forcing me to hold my ground. Trust is the only currency that matters in your profession. The moment that dossier lands on their desks, your firm will suspend you to protect their own liability. The regulatory board will freeze your executive license pending a lengthy investigation. Your clients will flee. Your reputation will evaporate before you can even hire a defense attorney to prove the documents are fake. You will spend the next 5 years and every dime of your savings fighting a ghost while your career burns to ash. I maintained steady eye contact, absorbing the calculated brutality of his counterattack. He had researched my vulnerabilities just as thoroughly as I had audited his financial history. He understood that my pristine professional record was my most valuable asset. He intended to use it as a hostage. So, here is how this is going to work, Trey whispered, offering a sharp, humorless smile. You are going to walk back into that ballroom and enjoy the champagne. You are going to stay quiet and let me finish the flip on the lakefront house. When the project is complete and the property is sold to a private buyer, I will route a generous percentage of the profits into an untraceable account for you. You get a cut of the cash, and you get to keep your pristine little career. He reached out and lightly tapped the shoulder of my emerald gown. The physical contact was a deliberate display of ownership. If you call the police or attempt to flag the title company, the dossier goes live, he stated, delivering the final ultimatum. You lose everything. The choice is yours. Trey did not wait for my response. He believed the checkmate was absolute. He turned his back on me, adjusted his velvet lapels, and walked back through the arched glass doors into the glittering ballroom to rejoin my oblivious brother. I stood alone on the outdoor terrace, the humid wind pulling at the silk of my gown. Trey thought he had neutralized the threat. He assumed I would calculate the risk of losing my career and choose silent compliance. He believed his blackmail forced me into a corner where surrender was the only mathematical option. He made a fatal miscalculation. Paying a blackmailer never buys peace. It only establishes a subscription service for future extortion. I did not intend to surrender my career, and I refused to let a parasite retain control of my sanctuary. I watched him disappear into the crowd of wealthy socialites. He played his hand, relying on fear and intimidation. The rules of engagement were now defined. I turned away from the glass doors, looking out over the dark horizon of the city. I needed to bypass the local authorities and execute a maneuver that would strip him of his leverage before he even realized the board had been flipped. I left the charity gala before the valet rush began. The drive from the historic downtown hotel to my corporate high-rise was a blur of streetlights and shifting shadows. Trey expected me to drive home in a state of paralyzing fear. He assumed his threat regarding the synthetic dossier would shatter my focus and force me into submission. He relied on the standard human reaction to blackmail, which is panic and erratic behavior. I do not process threats through an emotional lens. I process them as new variables entering an existing equation. Blackmail is merely a transaction, and every transaction has a structural weakness waiting to be exploited. I keyed into my office suite just past midnight. The building was empty. The silent floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the dark Austin skyline. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I sat down at my desk, illuminated only by the glow of my dual monitors. I needed to shift my focus away from Trey and his fabricated dossier. He was merely the localized symptom of the infection. The true disease was the $750,000 lien attached to my lakefront estate. I opened the digitized deed of trust I had downloaded earlier that morning. My eyes bypassed the forged signature on the execution block and locked on to the originating lender. The document listed a private equity holding group operating out of a corporate suite in Dallas. During my initial review, I classified them as a standard hard money lender. They provided rapid liquid capital in exchange for high interest rates, but the sheer speed of their underwriting process nagged at my analytical instincts. Normal hard money lenders still conduct basic due diligence. They verify identity to protect their own investment and ensure the collateral is secure. This Dallas entity wired an astronomical sum of cash to a man holding fabricated documents without verifying the legal owner of the dirt. That level of institutional negligence is rarely accidental. It is almost always a strategic calculation. I opened my proprietary intelligence terminal and initiated a trace on the holding group. I bypassed their glossy, public-facing website and dug deep into the state corporate registry. The architecture of their business model was obscured behind a labyrinth of proxy directors and anonymous limited liability companies registered in Delaware and Wyoming. It took me 2 hours of relentless digital excavation to piece together the fragmented data and pierce their corporate veil. When I finally breached the inner ledger, the reality of the situation altered the entire dynamic of the war. The Dallas Holding Group was not a legitimate regional bank. It was a shadow entity serving as the frontline acquisition arm for a ruthless private equity syndicate. I pulled their civil litigation history, scraping the state court dockets for the past decade. The results populated my screen in an endless cascade of hostile foreclosures and brutal property seizures. This syndicate did not generate their wealth by collecting monthly interest payments on commercial loans. They generated their wealth through predatory asset liquidation. Their business model relied on funding high-risk fraudulent flippers and desperate real estate developers. They sought out borrowers who possessed zero capability of repaying the principal sum. They offered predatory terms, knowing the borrower would inevitably default. The moment the borrower missed a single payment, the syndicate weaponized their legal division. They seized the collateral, rapidly auctioned it through back-channel networks, and swallowed the equity whole. I opened a specific court filing from 2 years ago to study their methodology. The syndicate had loaned $500,000 to a desperate commercial developer in Houston. The developer missed his second payment by 48 hours. The syndicate did not offer a grace period or a renegotiation. They filed an emergency injunction, locked the developer out of his own building, and liquidated the property within 30 days. They left the man bankrupt and homeless. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the staggering volume of their court victories. Trey thought he was the smartest operator in the room. He believed he had outmaneuvered a standard financial institution, utilizing his fake venture capitalist persona to secure seed money for his theatrical demolition project. He remained oblivious to his actual position on the food chain. He was a localized parasite who had unwittingly borrowed cash from apex predators. The syndicate did not care about his luxury wellness retreat illusion. They knew his financial history was garbage. They were just waiting for him to bleed out so they could take the waterfront house. The satisfaction of watching Trey walk blindfolded into a financial bear trap was eclipsed by a terrifying realization. That bear trap was currently bolted directly to my sanctuary. My initial strategy was built on passive observation. I intended to let Trey exhaust his stolen capital, string my parents along, and watch his phantom empire collapse under its own weight. I assumed that when the dust settled, I would simply step forward and evict the survivors from the ruins. But the discovery of the syndicate rendered that timeline obsolete. If I waited for Trey to default on his monthly interest payments, the syndicate would initiate a hostile foreclosure against the Lake Travis estate. They would file the seizure motions in civil court, asserting their right to the collateral. I would be forced to step out of the shadows and contest the foreclosure by presenting the forged signature to a judge. A naive property owner might assume a forged document instantly invalidates a commercial loan and solves the problem overnight. But the justice system does not operate on instant vindication. It operates on financial attrition. The private equity syndicate employed a small army of seasoned corporate litigators. They would not simply apologize and walk away when I claimed forgery. They would drag the dispute into the deep, dark waters of civil litigation. They would demand handwriting experts, forensic document audits, and lengthy sworn depositions. They would file endless injunctions tying up the title of the property for years. During that protracted legal battle, my asset would remain frozen. The exorbitant legal fees required to defend my rightful ownership would slowly drain my personal savings. More importantly, a highly public lawsuit over a fraudulent commercial loan would attract the exact kind of regulatory scrutiny Trey threatened to manufacture on the terrace. My actuarial firm would view the litigation as a severe reputational liability. My corporate partners despise negative press. My executive license would be placed under immediate review while the courts untangled the mess. The crossfire of the syndicate legal assault would achieve the exact professional destruction Trey promised. The pieces of the board snapped into sharp focus. I was caught between a blackmailer desperate to maintain his fake empire and a private equity firm engineering a hostile takeover of my land. I stood up from my desk, walking over to the glass windows overlooking the sleeping city. The air conditioning hummed quietly in the background, offering a steady rhythm to my racing thoughts. I could not just sit in the shadows and wait for Trey to fail. His failure was a mathematical certainty, but his descent would pull me down into the abyss with him. The syndicate held a legal tether attached directly to my property, and they were preparing to pull the heavy iron chain. I needed to sever their grip on my title immediately. I needed a specific legal mechanism that would nullify their deed of trust before Trey missed his first interest payment. I had to bypass the local police, ignore the blackmail threat, and execute a preemptive strike that the private equity lawyers would never see coming. I walked back to my desk and picked up my encrypted mobile device. The hour was late, but corporate warfare recognizes no standard business hours. I navigated to my contact list and selected a number I reserved exclusively for high-level legal emergencies. I needed a specialized litigator, and I knew exactly how to orchestrate the ambush. I held the encrypted mobile device to my ear, listening to the hollow ringtone echo in the silent office. The digital clock on my secondary monitor displayed 2 a.m. Men who specialize in high-stakes corporate litigation do not observe standard operating hours. On the 4th ring, the line clicked open. Marcus Thorne answered without offering a polite greeting. Marcus was not a defense attorney who performed for juries with emotional monologues. He was a real estate litigator. He operated like a legal sniper, dismantling complex corporate structures and invalidating fraudulent contracts with surgical precision. I did not waste his time with small talk. I outlined the exact parameters of the battlefield. I explained the tax deed, the forged commercial promissory note, the fake notary stamp, and the shadow private equity syndicate currently holding a lien against my waterfront property. I told him my brother-in-law utilized my stolen identity to extract $750,000 in seed capital to fund a phantom wellness retreat. Marcus listened, absorbing the raw data. He asked a single question regarding the execution date listed on the fraudulent loan documents. I read the date aloud from the digitized file. A low, steady hum of calculation vibrated through the receiver. Marcus laid out our options. The standard protocol for a civilian facing identity theft involves dialing the local authorities. Filing a formal police report initiates a criminal investigation. Detectives interview the victim, subpoena the title company, and attempt to track the rogue notary. Criminal justice is thorough, but it is inherently glacial. It requires months of bureaucratic friction. During that agonizing timeline, the fraudulent lien remains firmly attached to the property. The title remains encumbered. If Trey missed an interest payment while the detectives were busy building their case, the private equity syndicate would still possess the legal authority to initiate a hostile foreclosure. I told Marcus I could not afford a lengthy investigation. I needed the lien eradicated immediately. I needed to separate my sanctuary from the impending financial collapse of my brother-in-law. Marcus agreed. He proposed a maneuver that bypassed the criminal courts entirely. We would not wait for a detective to prove Trey committed a felony. We would execute a direct strike on the title itself, utilizing the civil court system. We were going to file a notice of superior title and initiate a quiet title action. To execute this strategy, Marcus required unassailable proof. He needed evidence so rigid and mathematical that no opposing corporate lawyer could dispute its authenticity. A forged signature is often a matter of opinion requiring subjective handwriting analysis. I needed to provide objective physical impossibility. I ended the call with Marcus and opened my corporate travel archive. The execution block on the fraudulent loan stated that I stood in a title office in Austin, Texas on a specific Tuesday afternoon, signing my name in the presence of a local notary. I am a senior risk actuary for an international firm. My movements are meticulously documented by corporate infrastructure. I pulled the data from that exact Tuesday. I downloaded the digital flight manifest from a commercial airline, proving I boarded a plane to Chicago at dawn. I extracted the hotel folio, detailing my check-in at a downtown Illinois conference center. I retrieved the geolocation logs from my encrypted corporate identification badge. The digital ledger showed me swiping into an actuarial summit seminar room 1,000 miles away at the exact minute the forged document was supposedly being signed in Texas. I compiled the flight records, the hotel receipts, and the digital badge logs into a single encrypted folder. I attached the certified copy of my unassailable tax deed. I transmitted the entire package to Marcus before the sun began to rise over the Austin skyline. The legal machinery engaged the very next morning. Marcus did not send the warning letter to Trey or the private equity syndicate. Warning a predator only gives them time to hide their assets. He walked directly into the Travis County Civil Courthouse and filed an emergency ex parte motion. A quiet title. Action is a specialized lawsuit designed to quiet any challenges or competing claims to a piece of real estate. When Marcus placed the filing on the judge desk, he presented a binary reality. On one side, the syndicate held a commercial loan based on a signature verified by a rogue notary. On the other side, Marcus presented my undeniable tax deed alongside a mountain of forensic corporate data proving physical impossibility. A person cannot sign a binding legal document in Texas while their security badge registers them inside a Chicago boardroom. The presiding judge reviewed the exhibits. The court recognizes that a lien attached to a property by an individual who does not hold the deed is inherently invalid. The forgery elevated the transaction from a simple mistake to systemic fraud. The judge did not hesitate. The magistrate signed the emergency injunction, issuing a court order that struck the syndicate deed of trust from the county registry. I sat in my high-rise office later that afternoon, watching the digital county portal update in real time. The legal scalpel sliced through the bureaucratic red tape. The encumbrance vanished from the screen. The Lake Travis estate was scrubbed clean. My title was restored to its pristine, unencumbered state. The brilliance of their quiet title strike lay in its silent execution. Trey remained entirely oblivious to the courtroom maneuver. He believed his blackmail threat at the charity gala had successfully paralyzed me. He thought he was currently operating from a position of supreme leverage, utilizing my silence to construct his fake empire on my property. He failed to understand the catastrophic financial shift that just occurred beneath his feet. When the judge nullified the lien, the $750,000 loan did not magically disappear. The private equity syndicate still wired that cash. But the classification of that debt underwent a terrifying transformation. 48 hours ago, the syndicate held a secured mortgage. If Trey failed to pay, they held the legal right to seize a prime waterfront estate worth millions. The real estate served as their safety net, ensuring they would always recover their initial investment plus a substantial profit. By scrubbing the title, I stripped the syndicate of their collateral. The massive loan was instantly transformed into an unsecured personal debt. The $750,000 was no longer tethered to the lucrative Texas dirt. It was now attached solely to the signatures of the two men who executed the paperwork, Trey and Mason. I looked at the glowing monitor, taking a slow sip of my coffee. A cold, calculating smile formed on my lips. I had achieved my objective without uttering a single threat or engaging in a chaotic family screaming match. I did not need to ruin my own career to stop his extortion. I simply removed the foundation holding his entire scheme together. When a shadow private equity firm loses their secured collateral, they do not write off the loss and walk away. Unsecured debt of that magnitude becomes toxic. The apex predators lose their patience. They do not wait for the borrower to initiate a polite repayment plan. They dispatch their recovery teams to extract the capital directly from the source. I had neutralized the syndicate threat against my sanctuary and weaponized their greed. I turned their crosshairs away from my property and painted a target directly onto Trey's chest. The trap was set and the spring was coiled tight. My new brother-in-law was busy hiring caterers and sending out digital invitations for a lavish project launch party at the estate. He intended to showcase his visionary development to the Austin elite. He had no idea that the safety net was gone, and the predators he borrowed from were about to realize their money was floating in the wind. The countdown to his public execution had officially begun. 2 weeks passed since the gavel fell in the civil courthouse. I spent those 14 days observing the digital feeds, maintaining a strict radio silence. Silence is often misinterpreted as surrender by those who operate on ego. Trey assumed his threat on the hotel terrace had successfully neutralized me. He believed I retreated into the safety of my corporate career, too terrified of a fabricated scandal to challenge his authority. He interpreted my absence as a white flag. That false sense of security provided the exact environment he needed to inflate his illusion to its maximum capacity. A parasite requires a host, but a con artist requires an audience. Trey could not just steal the seed capital and quietly drain it offshore. He needed to project momentum to keep my parents pacified and to attract secondary investors. He orchestrated a lavish project launch party at the Lake Travis estate. He sent out embossed digital invitations to the Austin elite, framing the event as an exclusive preview of his visionary wellness retreat. I watched the preparations unfold through the neighboring security camera. The estate was nowhere near completion. The initial demolition crew had gutted the interior and vanished the moment their initial retainer ran dry. The cedar deck was a memory. The gourmet kitchen was reduced to concrete subflooring and exposed timber studs. A standard property developer would delay a showcase until the drywall was finished and the fixtures were installed. Trey pivoted, utilizing the destruction as an aesthetic choice. He hired a premium event coordination firm to dress the ruins. They strung warm ambient Edison bulbs across the exposed ceiling joists. They draped sheer white fabric over the unfinished scaffolding. They positioned sleek, modern lounge furniture over the scarred concrete floors. Trey spun the active construction zone into a chic industrial backdrop. He sold the raw, unfinished state of the house as a symbol of bold progress and ground floor opportunity. On the evening of the event, the circular driveway transformed into a showroom of imported luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp black uniforms jogged across the ruined grass, parking Porsches and Maseratis. Inside the gutted living room, a hired string quartet played modern pop anthems. Waiters navigated the exposed floorboards, carrying silver trays loaded with artisan canapés and premium champagne. The alcohol flowed freely, funded entirely by the shadow loan Trey extracted using my stolen identity. William and Diane were in their element. They paraded around the outdoor patio, mingling with their country club friends and retired corporate executives. Diane held a sleek, digital tablet, displaying the same pristine architectural renderings Trey had shown at our disastrous family dinner. She pointed toward the dark tree line, boasting about the future meditation pavilions and the commercial spa facilities. William stood near the edge of the property, holding a glass of aged scotch, accepting premature congratulations for his son and his brilliant new husband. They basked in the reflected glory of a fabricated empire. I did not receive an invitation to the launch party. I did not require one. I pulled my sedan to a halt on the dark shoulder of the road, 50 yards away from the wrought iron gates. The humid Texas night wrapped around the vehicle. I did not wear an evening gown this time. I wore a tailored charcoal trench coat over a sharp black suit. The attire was functional, devoid of any celebratory pretense. I checked the time on my dashboard. Right on schedule, a marked white patrol vehicle with distinct green and gold lettering rolled to a stop directly behind my sedan. I stepped out onto the asphalt. 2 uniformed deputies from the Travis County Sheriff Department emerged from the cruiser. They wore heavy tactical belts and dark utility uniforms. I had arranged their presence hours in advance. I did not dial emergency services and report a crime in progress. I contacted the non-emergency dispatch and requested a formal civil standby. When a lawful property owner anticipates friction while accessing their own real estate, the county provides law enforcement to ensure the peace is maintained. The deputies are not there to serve warrants or conduct interrogations. They are physical deterrents tasked with preventing escalation while civil rights are exercised. I approached the lead deputy, handing him a certified copy of my absolute tax deed, along with my government identification. He illuminated the documents with a heavy tactical flashlight. He verified my name against the county's seal. He nodded, handing the paperwork back to me. He asked if I expected physical resistance. I told him my family was hosting an unauthorized event on my property, and they had altered the perimeter security without my consent. We walked together toward the main entrance. The heavy wrought iron gates stood closed, blocking the flow of the arriving guests. A valet attendant stood near the call box, looking confused, as the marked police cruiser flashed its amber hazard lights in the distance. I stepped up to the pedestrian entrance. The brass padlock my father installed 3 weeks ago hung from the latch, gleaming under the security lights. It was the physical manifestation of his authority. It was the boundary he drew to keep the skeptic out of his sanctuary. I pointed to the brass lock. I informed the deputy that I did not possess the key to this specific unauthorized hardware. The deputy did not ask for permission. He did not press the call box to negotiate with the occupants inside. He unclipped a radio from his vest, signaling his partner. The second deputy retrieved a pair of heavy-duty steel bolt cutters from the trunk of the patrol vehicle. He walked up to the iron gate, positioned the steel jaws around the thick brass shackle of the padlock, and compressed the handles. The lock surrendered with a sharp, echoing crack. The broken brass tumbled onto the asphalt. The deputy pushed the heavy iron gate inward. The physical barrier was breached. The illusion of my father control shattered onto the pavement. I walked up the long, sweeping driveway. The 2 uniformed deputies flanked me, matching my deliberate pace. The heels of my shoes clicked sharply against the exposed concrete. The rhythmic sound cut through the ambient noise of the party. I passed the valet stand, ignoring the wide-eyed attendant. I bypassed the rented sports cars and the temporary lighting rigs. The front doors of the estate were pinned wide open to allow the humid night breeze to circulate. I stepped over the threshold and entered the gutted living room. The atmosphere inside was a masterclass in synthetic luxury. The wealthy guests clustered in small groups, laughing and clinking their champagne flutes against the backdrop of exposed timber and hanging electrical wires. Mason stood near a makeshift bar, smiling radiantly, as a bartender poured him a fresh drink. Trey held court near the center of the room, utilizing his magnetic charisma to enchant a circle of potential investors. I did not shout to announce my presence. The visual impact of 2 armed county deputies walking into a high society gala handled the introduction for me. The guests positioned near the entryway noticed the uniforms first. The laughter in their immediate radius died. They stepped backward, lowering their drinks. The silence acted like a contagion, spreading rapidly outward from the front door. The cellist in the string quartet faltered, dragging her bow harshly across the strings before stopping entirely. The music stuttered and faded into an uncomfortable, heavy quiet. Trey paused mid-sentence. His charismatic smile remained frozen on his face, but his dark eyes darted toward the entryway. He saw the uniforms. He saw the charcoal trench coat. He calculated the variables, attempting to determine if this was a noise complaint or the execution of his blackmail threat. William noticed the shift in the room. He turned away from his country club friends, his brow furrowing in confusion. He pushed his way through the crowd of silent guests, walking toward the front of the house. When he saw me standing in the center of his gutted living room, flanked by law enforcement, the color drained from his face before returning in a rush of deep crimson. The embarrassment of having police officers disrupt his elite social event mutated instantly into territorial rage. He marched across the scarred concrete floor, stopping just a few feet away from the deputies. He ignored the officers, focusing his fury entirely on me. "Harper," he hissed, keeping his voice low in a desperate attempt to contain the scandal. "What is the meaning of this? How did you get past the gate? You were explicitly told you are no longer welcome here. You are ruining your brother launch event. I want you off my property right now before I have these officers arrest you for trespassing." He pointed a shaking finger toward the front door, attempting to reassert the authority he believed he possessed. The guests watched in breathless silence, treating the domestic implosion as live entertainment. I did not flinch. I did not engage with his anger or attempt to debate his fabricated authorities. Arguing with a squatter validates their delusion. I maintained steady eye contact, studying the flush skin of his neck and the white knuckle grip he held on his scotch glass. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored coat. I did not pull out a police report. I did not pull out a dossier of synthetic wire transfers. I extracted a single crisp white envelope. The paper was thick and pristine, stark against the dark fabric of my suit. I held the envelope out, suspended in the silent space between us. The heavy Austin humidity pressed down on the gutted room. Trey watched from the center of the crowd, his mind racing to analyze the unseen threat. The music was gone. The boasting was silenced. The stage was set for the execution. I kept my arm extended, holding the crisp white envelope in the stagnant air of the gutted living room. The ambient hum of the exposed Edison bulbs provided a low electric drone, masking the shallow breathing of the wealthy guests surrounding us. The two uniformed deputies stood on either side of me, projecting a wall of silent authority. They rested their hands near their tactical belts, observing the crowd with sterile professional detachment. They were not there to argue. They were there to ensure the enforcement of a judicial mandate. William stared at the envelope. His face remained flushed with territorial indignation. He operated under the assumption that I had arrived to deliver a petty legal threat regarding the brass padlock on the front gate. He believed the envelope contained a cease and desist letter drafted by some inexpensive local attorney demanding a spare key. He thought he retained the upper hand in a trivial domestic dispute over property boundaries. He snatched the envelope from my fingers. The sharp sound of tearing paper echoed across the scarred concrete floor. He pulled the thick, folded documents from the casing and snapped them open. I watched his eyes scan the top of the first page. He expected to see a generic legal letterhead. Instead, he saw the bold, unyielding typography of a Travis County civil court order. It was a formal statutory 3-day notice to quit. William frowned his cognitive functions, struggling to process the legal jargon. He read the bold print demanding the immediate surrender of the premises. He read the address of the Lake Travis estate, printed clearly under the eviction mandate. He flipped to the second page, searching for an explanation. Stapled directly behind the eviction notice was a certified copy of the county tax deed. The document bore the unmistakable raised seal of the Travis County clerk. It detailed the exact timeline of the tax lien certificates, the expiration of the statutory redemption period, and the final judicial transfer of the property. At the bottom of the page, in stark black ink, the document declared me as the sole separate and undisputed legal owner of the estate. I observed the physiological collapse of my father. The transformation was swift and devastating. The deep crimson flush of anger drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His shoulders slumped, losing the rigid aristocratic posture he had cultivated for decades. His hands began to tremble, causing the thick legal paper to rattle softly in the quiet room. The truth fractured his engineered reality. William realized he had not gifted a family legacy to his golden child. He had gifted a ghost. He had spent the last 5 years parading around a luxury waterfront estate that he lost to municipal tax delinquency. He hosted cocktail parties boasted to his country club associates and authorized a demolition project on a property he did not own. He installed a heavy brass padlock to keep out the very woman who held the actual deed to the dirt beneath his feet. He was not the patriarch of a wealthy Texas dynasty. He was a squatter holding an empty bag. Diane noticed the profound physical shift in her husband. She abandoned her conversation with a retired oil executive and hurried across the room. She touched William on the arm, asking him what the letter said. William could not form the words. His vocal cords failed him. He merely stared at the paper, his mind collapsing under the weight of his own profound humiliation. The elite social circle he sacrificed my youth to impress stood mere feet away, watching his aristocratic facade disintegrate in real time. Mason sensed the shifting atmospheric pressure. The golden boy stepped forward, holding a crystal flute of premium champagne. He possessed zero understanding of real estate law or municipal tax codes. He only understood that his perfect launch party was being interrupted. He looked at the uniformed deputies and then glared at me. "Harper, you need to leave," Mason demanded, his voice cracking with unearned entitlement. "You are ruining the aesthetic of the event. We have high-level investors here. You cannot just bring police officers to my house because you are jealous of our project." I did not respond to my brother. I did not need to correct his delusion. The paper in William's trembling hands held all the necessary corrections. Mason turned toward his husband, expecting his brilliant venture capitalist partner to resolve the friction. "Trey, fix this," Mason pleaded, pulling on the sleeve of the velvet dinner jacket. "Tell them about the zoning permits. Tell them they have to leave our property." Trey stepped forward. He maintained his smooth, composed exterior, but the rhythm of his calculated breathing betrayed his internal tension. He reached out and smoothly pulled the stapled documents from William's limp fingers. Trey is a professional predator. He does not read legal documents with the emotional fragility of my father or the ignorant entitlement of my brother. He reads them seeking structural weaknesses. He reads them looking for the trap. His dark eyes scanned the 3-day notice to quit. He flipped to the tax deed. He saw the authentic raised seal of the county clerk. Trey already knew I owned the property. He had discovered that fact weeks ago when he initiated the hard money loan application. That was the exact reason he fabricated my identity documents and forged my signature on the commercial promissory note. He thought he had bypassed my ownership, keeping the theft hidden in the bureaucratic shadows. He assumed his blackmail threat on the hotel terrace had successfully terrified me into silence. He believed I would stay hidden in my corporate office, too afraid of a synthetic scandal to challenge his operation. The documents in his hands proved his psychological profile of me was fatally flawed. I did not retreat. I mobilized the legal system and marched law enforcement directly through his front door. But the true terror registering in Trey's eyes was not the fear of a simple eviction. It was the realization of the collateral damage. Trey understood the mechanical gears of the civil justice system. By executing a formal court-ordered eviction, I was placing the Lake Travis estate under immediate judicial scrutiny. The moment a judge oversees an eviction, the property title becomes a matter of active public record. The county clerks would inevitably audit the recent filings. The fraudulent $750,000 deed of trust he secured from the Dallas Holding Group would be exposed to the sunlight. Trey realized his forged loan was built on a foundation of sand. His entire operation required darkness and delay. He needed time to route the remaining stolen capital through his offshore crypto wallets before the private equity lenders noticed the missing interest payments. My preemptive strike detonated his timeline. By forcing an eviction, I was accelerating the discovery of his fraud. The charismatic sneer vanished from his face. The velvet dinner jacket suddenly looked like a straitjacket. He stared at the county seal, his mind grinding through the shifting variables. He calculated the distance to the back door. He calculated the odds of talking his way past the 2 armed deputies standing in the entryway. He realized he possessed no leverage. The synthetic dossier he threatened to release meant nothing against the physical presence of law enforcement executing a judicial mandate. He was standing in a gutted living room, surrounded by wealthy witnesses, holding the undeniable proof of his impending ruin. He needed to pivot. He needed to manufacture a lie to pacify the deputies and buy himself enough time to flee the perimeter. He lowered the paperwork. He pasted a calm, synthetic smile onto his voice and opened his mouth to speak. He intended to deploy his magnetic charm to de-escalate the tension. Before a single syllable could escape his throat, a new sound pierced the heavy, humid air of the Texas night. It was not the wail of police sirens. It was a harsh, heavy, mechanical rhythm. The sound of thick, aggressive rubber tires crunching over the gravel driveway echoed through the open front doors. The noise was loud, deliberate, and synchronized. The rhythmic crunching grew closer, drowning out the ambient hum of the party. The executioner had arrived, and they did not carry standard law enforcement badges. The rhythmic crunching of heavy rubber treads over gravel amplified in the humid night air. Through the wide-open front doors, the glow of halogen headlights sliced across the ambient darkness of the sweeping driveway. 4 identical utility vehicles rolled into the perimeter. Their paint matched the pitch black of the Texas sky. Heavy tinted windows obscured their interiors, ensuring total anonymity. The drivers did not navigate toward the designated parking zones or wait for the valets to approach. They positioned their reinforced frames in a diagonal formation across the entrance, sealing the exit routes. The rented sports cars and luxury sedans belonging to the Austin elite were effectively penned in. The engines idled for a fraction of a second before cutting off in flawless unison. The heavy doors swung open. Men stepped onto the concrete. They did not wear tactical vests or carry the visible badges of law enforcement. They wore tailored wool suits, cut with surgical precision. Their silk ties were dark, their leather shoes polished to a mirror finish. They projected the aesthetic of standard corporate executives, but their physical movements betrayed a different reality. They moved with the synchronized fluid economy of apex predators. Their eyes were cold, sterile, and hyper-vigilant, scanning the environment, assessing the structural layout of the estate, and calculating optimal extraction paths. These were the recovery agents representing the Dallas Private Equity Holding Group. They had spent their morning digesting the legal shockwave Marcus initiated in the civil courthouse. When the magistrate signed the emergency injunction granting my quiet title action, the Syndicate received an automated registry alert. They discovered their ironclad deed of trust was erased from the Travis County records. The prime waterfront real estate they relied upon to anchor their capital was legally untouchable. The $750,000 they wired to my brother-in-law was no longer tethered to a tangible asset. It was floating in the wind, secured only by the signature of a con artist. Shadow financial entities do not send polite emails when they lose their safety net. They dispatch specialized personnel to reclaim their investment. The men walked up the driveway, maintaining a steady, methodical pace. The valet attendants, accustomed to handling demanding country club patrons, took one look at the approaching formation and stepped backward onto the grass, lowering their heads in submissive silence. The string quartet inside the house remained frozen. The guests held their breath. The 2 Travis County Sheriff deputies, standing beside me, shifted their weight. They rested their hands near their duty belts, tracking the approaching men. The deputies were present to maintain the peace during a civil eviction. The Syndicate men had not drawn weapons. They had not issued verbal threats. They were legally permitted to attend a social gathering. The officers held their ground, establishing a silent boundary, waiting for a statutory violation to dictate their response. The lead representative stepped over the threshold, his hard soles clicking against the exposed floorboards. He bypassed the local politicians and the retired executives. He ignored the catered trays of artisan canapes and the rented ambient lighting. He did not glance at my father, who stood paralyzed clutching the eviction notice. He did not look at Mason, who trembled holding a half-empty crystal flute. The lead enforcer locked his sterile gaze directly onto the velvet dinner jacket standing in the center of the room. 3 other agents filed into the space, moving with practiced efficiency. They fanned out, creating a physical perimeter. They positioned themselves between Trey and the arched glass doors leading to the outdoor terrace. They blocked the hallway leading to the rear exits. They encircled their target, cutting off every potential avenue of escape. The wealthy guests finally processed the nature of the intrusion. They recognized the stark difference between a high society disagreement and a corporate collection operation. The influencers slowly backed away, pressing their shoulders against the exposed drywall, desperate to distance themselves from the epicenter of the impending fallout. Trey stood trapped within the human ring. The charismatic architect of the wellness retreat illusion evaporated. The physical transformation was rapid and severe. The confident posture he utilized to enchant my parents crumbled. His shoulders rounded inward. The midnight blue velvet fabric designed to project quiet luxury now appeared suffocating. A sheen of perspiration formed along his hairline, catching the warm glow of the Edison bulbs. He tried to swallow, but his throat seized. He looked at the men surrounding him, searching for a sympathetic face, a negotiable variable, a sliver of leverage. He found only granite. The lead representative stopped 2 feet away from Trey. He did not raise his voice. He did not shout to intimidate the room. True authority never requires volume. He spoke in a low, resonant register that cut through the silence with lethal clarity. We received a notification from the Travis County Civil Court this morning. The man stated, keeping his hands loosely clasped in front of him. A judge nullified our deed of trust. The title to this property belongs to a third party. Our legal department informs us that the signature on our promissory note was fabricated. Trey opened his mouth, his jaw working frantically to form a defense. There is a misunderstanding. He rasped, his voice thin and hollow. The zoning permits require processing. The title company made a clerical error. I can fix the paperwork tomorrow. The representative did not blink. He did not entertain the lie. The paperwork is irrelevant, the man replied, his tone devoid of frustration. The collateral is gone. We operate a highly structured investment portfolio. We do not carry unsecured debt. You extracted $750,000 from our reserves 48 hours ago. We are here to balance the ledger. William and Diane stood near the edge of the perimeter, their eyes wide, their breath shallow. For weeks they had paraded this man around their elite social circle. They defended his vision. They insulted their own daughter to protect his ego. They believed he was the key to their financial salvation. Now the glossy veneer was stripped away. They watched in paralyzing horror as the visionary venture capitalist was exposed as a desperate fraud, cornered by private equity enforcers. Mason dropped his crystal flute. The delicate glass shattered against the concrete subflooring, the sound sharp and jarring, but nobody flinched. The golden boy stared at his husband, waiting for the brilliant entrepreneur to unveil a master plan to outsmart the men in the sharp suits to prove the skeptics wrong. But Trey possessed no master plan. His entire operational blueprint relied on targeting naive victims and exploiting bureaucratic delays. He leveraged the slow pace of the legal system to extract cash and vanish before the consequences arrived. He never accounted for a preemptive strike on the title. He never calculated the risk of the syndicate discovering his forgery before he could route the funds into untraceable offshore accounts. He looked into the dead eyes of the lead representative and realized the brutal arithmetic of his situation. He could not charm his way out of this deficit. He could not manipulate men who viewed him merely as a negative integer on a balance sheet. I need time. Trey stammered, his polished vocabulary replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. The capital is tied up in preliminary development phases. I just need a few days to liquidate the assets and transfer the principal back to your holding group. The lead representative tilted his head a fraction of an inch, a subtle gesture of terminal impatience. You do not have a few days, the enforcer countered his voice, dropping another octave. You do not have a few hours. The funds were wired to an exchange account under your direct control. We will accompany you to a secure terminal. You will initiate the reverse wire transfer tonight. If the balance is short, we will begin discussing alternative methods of repayment. The air inside the gutted living room turned thick and unbreathable. The lead syndicate representative did not flinch or break eye contact. He waited for Trey to process the ultimatum. He demanded a localized wire transfer to reverse the stolen capital. The request was a mathematical impossibility. Predators of Trey caliber do not keep stolen funds sitting idle in accessible domestic accounts. They disperse the capital rapidly across decentralized networks to cover their previous tracks and fund their immediate lifestyle. The money was already gone. Trey understood the brutal mechanics of private equity enforcers. They do not accept apologies. They do not care about the visionary potential of an unfinished wellness retreat. They extract their pound of flesh from whoever holds the liability. When a parasite realizes it is trapped in a burning host, it will gnaw off its own limbs to survive. Desperation stripped away the last remaining layers of Trey-polished persona. He realized he could not charm his way past the men blocking the exits. He required a human shield. Trey turned his body away from the enforcer. He extended a shaking finger and pointed directly across the scarred concrete floor. He did not point at me. He did not point at the local deputies. He pointed at Mason. My brother stood near the makeshift bar, his hands trembling as he stared at the unfolding nightmare. Mason is the primary guarantor. Trey shouted, his voice cracking with raw cowardice. He handled the domestic ledgers. He managed the credit lines. I only provided the architectural vision for the project. Mason signed the underwriting documents. His name is on the principal agreement. If you want your capital back, you need to extract it from him and his family. The silence that followed this betrayal was heavy and suffocating. The wealthy guests who had spent the evening congratulating the happy couple now watched a ruthless operator throw his husband to the wolves. Mason stared at the man he married. The physical impact of the betrayal struck him like a blunt instrument. His mouth opened, but his lungs refused to draw air. For 27 years, my parents insulated Mason from every harsh reality. They funded his failed art exhibits. They shielded him from accountability. They constructed a padded universe where he was the center of gravity. In a matter of seconds, that padded universe disintegrated. The truth clicked into place behind his wide, terrified eyes. He looked at the tailored velvet dinner jacket and the expensive timepiece on Trey's wrist. He finally saw the transaction hiding beneath the romance. The marriage was never built on affection or shared dreams. It was a calculated corporate infiltration. Trey identified Mason as the perfect Trojan horse. My brother possessed pristine, unused credit, a naive desperation for validation, and an aristocratic family that appeared to hold immense liquid wealth. Trey utilized the wedding vows to bypass the gates of the Lake Travis estate. Mason was never a partner. He was a disposable asset. He was a pristine credit score wrapped in a tuxedo utilized to extract seed money from a shadow lending firm. The psychological weight of the deception crushed the remaining strength from Mason's legs. His knees buckled. He collapsed onto the exposed subflooring. The sharp concrete scraped against his expensive, tailored trousers, but he did not seem to feel the physical pain. He curled his shoulders inward, weeping with loud, frantic gasps. The golden boy was reduced to a terrified child, cornered by men who intended to ruin his life. He scrambled across the floor on his hands and knees, seeking the only source of protection he had ever known. He reached the edge of the crowd and grabbed the fabric of my father's trousers. "Dad, you have to pay them," Mason pleaded, his voice wet with tears. "You have to write them a check." Trey lied to me. I did not know about the forged signatures. "Please do not let them take me away." "Fix this, Dad." "You have to fix this right now." The desperate plea echoed off the exposed ceiling joists. The Austin elite, the local politicians, and the retired executives watched the scene with morbid fascination. They waited for William to fulfill his role. They waited for the wealthy patriarch to pull out a pristine checkbook, scold the intruders, and resolve the financial dispute with a stroke of a pen. William stepped forward. The instinct to protect his golden child flared within his chest. He puffed out his chest, attempting to summon the aristocratic authority he had projected for decades. He looked at the lead syndicate representative. "Listen to me," William ordered, projecting his voice across the room. "You will step away from my son. We will contact our wealth management firm in the morning, and we will settle this ledger. You have my word as a gentleman. The lead representative did not step back. He tilted his head, observing my father with sterile, analytical detachment. He recognized the bluff. Enforcers who spend their lives liquidating distressed commercial real estate develop a sixth sense for financial insolvency. They can smell bankruptcy. The syndicate man reached into his tailored jacket and retrieved a digital tablet. He tapped the screen and held it up for William to see. "Your word holds zero currency," the representative stated, his voice echoing with cold finality. "We audited your financial profile the moment the court nullified our deed of trust. Your boutique consulting firm was dissolved 5 years ago. You carry maximum balances on 4 different revolving credit lines. You lease your vehicles. You have less than $2,000 in liquid checking. You cannot write a check to cover a $750,000 deficit." William froze. The tablet screen reflected in his eyes, displaying the grim reality of his hidden poverty. The representative took one step closer, invading my father's personal space. "You are standing in the house you do not own, defending a son who just guaranteed a fraudulent loan. You have nothing left to leverage. Step aside before we add you to the liability roster." The threat shattered the final pillar of my father-engineered reality. The air rushed out of his lungs. He looked down at Mason, who was still clinging to his legs, sobbing and begging for salvation. William opened his mouth to speak, but the aristocratic pride was gone. "I cannot fix it," William whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his own failure. He looked up, meeting the eyes of the wealthy country club associates who stood mere feet away. The friends he had spent decades trying to impress were now acting as the jury for his public execution. He could not maintain the lie any longer. The truth demanded to be spoken. "I do not have the money," William confessed, the words tearing at his throat. "I am broke. I lost the consulting firm. I stopped paying the property taxes. I lost this house 5 years ago. I have nothing left to give you." The confession dropped into the room like a physical weight. Diane let out a sharp, strangled gasp, covering her face with both hands. She turned her back to the crowd, unable to bear the shame of their exposure. The elite friends whispered among themselves, their eyes darting from William to the gutted kitchen and then to the syndicate men. The polished illusion William and Diane sacrificed everything to maintain turned to ash in a matter of seconds. The social death was absolute. They would never be welcomed back to the country club. They would never sit at another VIP table. They were exposed as fraudulent squatters, living on borrowed time and stolen credit. The lead syndicate representative ignored the weeping family. He turned his attention back to Trey, who was slowly backing toward the arched glass doors, hoping the domestic implosion would provide a window for his escape. "Your shield just broke," the representative informed Trey. "There is no family fortune to absorb your deficit. The principal remains unpaid." Trey hit the glass door, his escape route blocked by 2 other enforcers who stepped into his path. The predator was finally caught in a trap he could not manipulate. The syndicate prepared to escalate their collection methods. But I was not finished dismantling the operation. I stood near the entryway, watching the golden boy weep and the patriarch crumble. It was time to show the room exactly where the stolen capital went and seal the fate of the venture capitalist. I reached into my trench coat and retrieved my encrypted digital tablet. The final autopsy of the Phantom Empire was about to begin. I walked past my weeping brother and stepped into the center of the gutted living room. The space was trapped in a heavy silence following the confession of my father. The local politicians, the wealthy influencers, and the retired executives remained frozen in place. I bypassed the syndicate enforcers. My charcoal trench coat shifted as I moved toward the focal point of the party. A large flat-panel smart television hung on the exposed timber studs near the makeshift bar. The event coordinators had installed the screen to display the pristine architectural renderings of the fake wellness retreat, looping images of infinity pools and luxury pavilions. I pulled my encrypted digital tablet from my pocket. I did not ask for permission to commandeer the screen. I synced my device to the television, utilizing the local wireless network. The glowing images of the fabricated sanctuary vanished. The screen blinked black for a fraction of a second before illuminating the room with raw, unfiltered financial data. The forensic audit I conducted over the past 2 weeks populated the large display. I structured the presentation as a visual timeline designed to be understood by anyone in the room. A bright green line represented the initial $750,000 wire transfer originating from the Dallas private equity firm. The line traced the digital journey of the stolen capital. I turned to face the crowd, holding the tablet in my hand. I explained the flow of the money, keeping my voice measured and clinical. When a legitimate developer secures a commercial loan, the funds are deposited into an escrow account or a dedicated business ledger to purchase building materials and pay local labor. I pointed to the screen. The green line on the display did not route into a local Texas bank. It bypassed domestic financial institutions entirely. It routed directly into an offshore decentralized cryptocurrency exchange located in a jurisdiction that ignores federal subpoenas. I tapped the glass of my tablet, advancing the graphic. The single green line to capital shattered into a dozen smaller red branches. The money was converted into untraceable digital tokens and distributed across multiple international borders. I displayed the final destination accounts on the screen. The ledgers belonged to angry investors tied to the previous 12 dissolved shell companies operated by my brother-in-law. The entities spanned across Nevada, California, and Florida. He did not secure the Dallas loan to build a luxury spa in Austin. He secured the capital to pay off the people he defrauded 3 years ago. The architecture of his operation was not elite venture capital. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme. He required fresh victims to satisfy old debts, keeping the illusion afloat just long enough to extract his own management fees before the entire structure collapsed under its own fraudulent weight. The Lake Travis estate was simply the newest prop in a long-running theatrical production designed to extract wealth from the gullible. The visual evidence was undeniable. The spreadsheets, the routing numbers, and the time-stamped wire transfers glowed against the dark room, reflecting in the eyes of the wealthy attendees. The local investors Trey had spent the evening enchanting realized they had narrowly avoided a fatal financial snare. They stepped further back towards the walls, distancing themselves from the toxic center of the room. The revelation did not merely educate the Austin elite. It triggered a localized detonation among a specific group of attendees. Trey had invited several local general contractors to the launch party. He utilized their physical presence in the room to project authenticity and momentum to his potential investors. The foreman who coordinated the demolition of the cedar deck stood near the catering tables, wearing a stiff tailored suit over his thick, heavy frame. He watched the digital numbers flow into offshore accounts. He performed the mental arithmetic regarding his own unpaid invoices. The foreman set his drink down on the scarred concrete floor. He did not care about the country club etiquette or the social standing of the guests. He pushed his way through the crowd of silent socialites. 3 of his senior crew members followed his lead. They formed a secondary perimeter behind the Syndicate enforcers. The foreman pointed a thick, calloused finger at the television screen and then turned his focus to the velvet dinner jacket. The contractor demanded his paycheck. He stated his crew had worked 14-hour shifts, tearing the house apart, based on the promise of a massive wire transfer scheduled to clear the following morning. He had purchased heavy machinery rentals and waste management services on his own business credit. The forensic audit proved the operating accounts were barren. The demolition crew had labored for weeks on empty promises, financing the illusion of a wealthy man out of their own working-class pockets. The physical tension inside the gutted living room escalated into a tangible, suffocating force. Trey was trapped in a tightening vice of his own creation. On his left stood the Dallas private equity representatives, demanding the immediate return of $750,000. On his right stood a crew of furious blue-collar contractors, realizing their livelihoods were compromised, demanding their unpaid labor wages. At his feet lay the shattered golden boy, weeping into the concrete subflooring, realizing his marriage was a corporate extraction. Across the room, his former aristocratic father-in-law stared at the floor, stripped of his dignity and his fake empire unable to offer a single dollar of salvation. The Syndicate lead representative did not yield ground to the angry contractors. The enforcer viewed the blue-collar workers as a nuisance, an obstacle blocking his access to the primary target. The syndicate man took another deliberate step forward, closing the physical distance between himself and Trey. The foreman cracked his knuckles, stepping up to the opposite side, demanding immediate liquidation of the debt. The overlapping demands filled the room, creating a chaotic chorus of financial retribution. The polished high society Gala deteriorated into a brutal collection yard. I watched Trey process the convergence of these lethal threats. The smooth velvet dinner jacket offered no protection against the raw, predatory energy closing in on him. His dark eyes darted across the room, absorbing the data. He looked at the television screen, broadcasting his guilt to the Austin elite. He looked at the hard, unforgiving faces of the men surrounding him. He realized his natural charisma was dead. His blackmail material, guarding my actuarial career, was entirely useless against men who only cared about missing capital. He possessed zero leverage to negotiate a truce and zero cash to buy a delay. The creditors were no longer waiting for a polite email explanation or a fake architectural permit. They were preparing to extract their payment through physical force. The survival instinct of a cornered predator engaged, overriding his polished social programming. He recognized that remaining inside the human perimeter meant enduring a brutal physical reckoning that would likely end with him in an emergency room. The only mathematical option left on his board was flight. Trey shifted his weight to his back foot, calculating the exact distance to the nearest exit. He looked toward the front doors, but the two Travis County Sheriff deputies stood on the threshold, serving as an impassable barrier. He scanned the hallway leading to the guest suites, but a syndicate enforcer blocked the narrow passage. His eyes locked onto the arched glass doors leading to the outdoor terrace. The darkness of the Texas night offered the only camouflage available. He prepared to shatter the remaining illusion by running into the shadows, abandoning his husband, his investors, and his fabricated empire. The physical confrontation inside the living room provided the perfect localized distraction. The demolition foreman shoved his broad shoulder into the chest of the lead syndicate enforcer. The suit pushed back. The overlapping shouts regarding unpaid labor and stolen principal escalated into a volatile clash of competing creditors. The wealthy guests gasped, retreating further toward the perimeter. The localized gravity of the room shifted entirely toward the brewing violence near the smart television. Trey recognized the window of opportunity. He operated on the instinct of a parasite, abandoning a dying host. He let his shoulders drop, minimizing his physical profile. He took a slow, measured step backward, peeling himself away from the edge of the conflict. The ambient Edison bulbs cast harsh shadows across the scarred concrete floor, providing natural camouflage. He slipped behind a group of terrified socialites and pivoted toward the rear of the estate. His dark eyes tracked the exposed timber studs framing the gutted kitchen. Beyond the skeletal remains of the culinary prep stations lay a narrow corridor leading to the service doors and the dark wooded acreage bordering the lake. He calculated the trajectory. If he reached the tree line, he could navigate the neighboring properties, secure a rideshare on the main highway, and access a secondary stash of emergency cash hidden in a local safety deposit box. He stepped over a pile of shattered drywall and entered the dark hallway. The ambient noise of the shouting creditors faded, slightly muffled by the structural remains of the house. He exhaled a ragged breath, believing he had successfully slipped the snare. He did not escape the snare. I built the snare. A risk actuary does not simply expose a vulnerability and walk away. We anticipate the resulting variables. We map out the escape routes, and we seal them before we initiate the sequence. I knew Trey would attempt a rear extraction the moment the financial pressure exceeded his capacity to manipulate the room. I had repositioned myself during the height of the argument, vacating my spot near the entryway. I stood in the center of the dark corridor. The charcoal fabric of my trench coat blended into the shadows. I blocked the narrow passage, offering zero room for negotiation. Trey rounded the corner and stopped abruptly. His expensive leather shoes scraped against the subflooring. The frantic energy of his escape collided with the cold, stationary reality of my presence. He looked over his shoulder, checking to see if the syndicate enforcers had noticed his departure. The hallway remained empty behind him. He turned his attention back to me, his jaw tight with desperation. "Move out of the way, Harper," he demanded, his voice a harsh, frantic whisper. He dropped the charismatic facade entirely. He raised his hands, stepping forward, attempting to utilize his physical size to force a path through the corridor. "I have a vehicle waiting. If I stay in that room, those men are going to kill me. You have your house back. You won. Now step aside." I did not step aside. I maintained my ground, forcing him to halt, just inches away from my space. The air in the narrow hallway smelled of settled dust and panicked sweat. "You thought the forged loan was your masterpiece?" I murmured, my voice cutting through the ambient noise drifting from the living room. "You believed fabricating an identity to extract capital from a shadow lender proved your superiority." He gritted his teeth, reaching out to grab my shoulder and physically move me into the exposed studs. I did not flinch. I held his gaze, paralyzing his momentum with the sheer weight of the impending calculation. "But you forgot the mechanism I stated." Trey hesitated, his hand hovering in the air. The word mechanism caught in his analytical mind. He processed the phrasing, searching for the trap he failed to identify. I stepped forward, forcing him to take a half step backward into the dust. "You view real estate fraud as a localized transaction. You forge a signature in Texas, you record a deed in Texas, you extract capital from a Texas entity. If you had taken the cash and buried it in the backyard, you would be facing state-level charges. A smart criminal defense attorney might argue jurisdictional nuances or drag the trial out for years in a local municipal court." I kept my tone clinical, dissecting his operation like a biological specimen. "But you required liquidity," I continued. "You needed to pay off the angry investors from your dissolved shell companies in Nevada and California. You routed the stolen capital into an offshore cryptocurrency exchange to launder the transaction." The color drained from his face for a second time. The realization began to crack the foundation of his survival strategy. "The moment you authorized an interstate digital transfer of fraudulent funds, you altered the legal classification of your crime," I explained. "You escalated a local real estate dispute into a violation of federal statutes. You utilized interstate wires to execute a financial crime. That is wire fraud. It falls under the direct jurisdiction of the United States Department of Justice." Trey lowered his hands. His breathing turned shallow and erratic. He looked at the shadows surrounding us, realizing the darkness offered no actual protection. "Do you remember the conversation we had on the hotel terrace?" I asked, recalling the night he threatened my actuarial career. "You promised to generate a synthetic dossier accusing me of embezzlement. You claimed the mere whisper of an investigation would cost me my executive license. You believed that blackmail neutralized me." He stared at me, unable to formulate a countermeasure. "A fabricated dossier holds zero weight when the sender is facing a federal indictment," I informed him. "Regulatory boards do not entertain anonymous tips from international money launderers. Your leverage was an illusion. I did not just file a quiet title action to scrub my deed. The morning I secured the court order, I exported the entire forensic packet, detailing your routing numbers, your forged notary stamps, and your offshore crypto wallets. I let the final variable drop into the equation. I transmitted that data packet to the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation 48 hours ago." The velvet dinner jacket seemed to swallow him whole. Trey recognized the fatal parameters of his reality. He could run through the dark woods. He could secure a rideshare. He could access his hidden cash. None of it mattered. He was not running from a localized debt collector. He was running from the federal government. They track digital footprints across borders. They freeze international accounts. They execute warrants with terrifying precision. He possessed nowhere to hide. He opened his mouth, trying to negotiate a truce that no longer existed. Before a single word of his desperate bargain could materialize, the atmosphere inside the estate shifted. A sharp, piercing sound cut through the humid night air. It did not originate from the living room. It originated from the main highway, winding along the lake. The wail of sirens rose in the distance. The mechanical pitch was high and aggressive, overlapping in a synchronized chorus that indicated a multi-unit response. The shouting in the living room ceased instantly. The Syndicate enforcers, the furious contractors, and the wealthy guests turned their attention toward the open front doors. The sound of the sirens grew louder, closing the distance at a rapid pace. Trey stood frozen in the dark hallway. The wail of the approaching vehicles vibrated through the exposed timber framing. He looked past my shoulder toward the shattered kitchen windows. The darkness outside shattered. Flashing red and blue lights swept across the unmanicured lawn. The strobe effect pierced the glass, illuminating the corridor in erratic bursts. The colors painted the exposed drywall and the concrete subflooring, casting long, unnatural shadows across Trey's terrified face. The authorities bypassed the broken wrought iron gates and flooded the circular driveway. The federal trap was officially sprung, and the architect of the Phantom Empire was caught dead in the center. The strobe effect of the federal emergency vehicles painted the exposed drywall in erratic bursts of crimson and sapphire. The wail of the sirens died abruptly, replaced by the sharp mechanical sounds of doors slamming and heavy boots hitting the gravel. The chaotic energy inside the estate shifted from localized financial disputes to sheer atmospheric panic. The wealthy influencers, the retired executives, and the furious local contractors recognized the gravity of the arriving force. They backed away from the center of the house, pressing their bodies against the unfinished timber framing, trying to erase their connection to the fraudulent launch party. I remained standing in the narrow corridor, blocking the rear exit. Trey turned his head, frantic, tracking the noise. The heavy wooden service doors located just beyond the skeletal kitchen framing burst open. Federal agents poured into the rear of the property. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with stark yellow lettering, identifying their division. They moved with a synchronized, terrifying efficiency that made the earlier posturing of the private equity enforcers look like amateur theater. They did not shout general threats or ask for identification. They executed a coordinated breach, sealing the perimeter and locking down the estate. A secondary team flooded through the wide-open front doors, neutralizing the primary living room. Trey realized the back exit was compromised. He spun around, intending to push past me and find another route through the dark interior of the house. He took one aggressive step forward, his velvet dinner jacket catching the erratic strobe lights. He never took a second step. Two federal agents rounded the corner from the kitchen, cutting off his trajectory. They did not hesitate or attempt to negotiate a peaceful surrender. They lunged forward, gripping the expensive fabric of his tailored suit. The physical momentum carried Trey backward. The agents forced him downward, slamming his chest hard against the concrete surface of the unfinished kitchen island. A cloud of fine white drywall dust plumed into the air, catching in the harsh beams of the tactical flashlights. Trey gasped for breath, his cheek pressed flat against the cold, abrasive concrete. The polished, charismatic venture capitalist was erased. He was just a desperate operator, pinned under the weight of federal authority. An agent pulled Trey, arms sharply behind his back. The distinct metallic ratcheting sound of steel cuffs echoing through the corridor signaled the permanent end of his illusion. "You have the right to remain silent." The arresting agent stated his voice, a dull, practiced monotone. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." I stepped out of the shadows of the hallway, walking past the kitchen island. Trey rolled his eyes upward, struggling against the grip of the officers. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of profound shock and raw terror. He finally understood the fatal error of his calculation. He brought a forged signature to a war of attrition, and I brought the United States Department of Justice. I did not offer a parting remark. I did not gloat. I simply continued walking, stepping over the debris and returning to the center of the living room to observe the remaining variables resolve themselves. The scene in the primary gathering space was a masterclass in risk management. The Dallas private equity representatives demonstrated exactly why they are apex predators. When the federal agents breached the front entryway, the men in the sharp suits did not argue. They did not resist or attempt to assert their dominance. They recognized immediately that a bigger predator had entered the ecosystem. The lead enforcer and his associate stepped back from the center of the room. They raised their hands slowly, keeping their palms visible and non-threatening. They smoothly pivoted their strategy, abandoning their physical intimidation tactics to avoid federal obstruction charges. They allowed the agents to sweep past them and secure the premises. But a shadow lending firm does not write off a missing $750,000 just because the primary target is wearing steel bracelets. When the primary debtor is neutralized, the liability transfers to the secondary signature. The lead syndicate representative lowered his hands, adjusting his silk tie. He looked down at Mason, who remained curled on the scarred subflooring, weeping into his hands. The enforcer reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a thick, bound packet of legal documents. He stepped over to my brother, looking down at him with sterile detachment. "Your husband is currently indisposed," the enforcer stated, his low voice cutting through the ambient noise of the raid. "However, the principal debt remains active. You signed the underwriting documents. You are the primary guarantor on the account." The representative dropped the heavy stack of paperwork directly onto Mason's lap. The pages spilled across my brother's legs, revealing the bold headers of a catastrophic civil litigation lawsuit. "We are holding you jointly liable for the missing funds," the enforcer continued. "Our legal department will freeze your personal accounts by tomorrow morning. We will garnish your future wages. We will pursue civil asset forfeiture against any property you acquire until the ledger is balanced. You married the liability, and now you own it." Mason stared at the legal documents, his tears dripping onto the crisp, white paper. His pristine credit score, the very asset Trey manipulated to secure the loan, was now a weapon aimed directly at his own financial future. He would spend the next 2 decades digging himself out of a deficit he never truly understood. The golden boy was permanently tarnished. As the syndicate men turned and walked out the front doors, leaving the federal agents to catalog the scene, the 2 Travis County Sheriff deputies resumed their original objective. They had stood by maintaining the peace while the federal raid unfolded. Now that the criminal element was secured and hauled out to a waiting transport cruiser, the civil mandate took priority. The lead deputy approached William and Diane. My parents stood near the edge of the room, isolated from their former friends. The aristocratic posture they maintained for my entire life was entirely broken. William stared blankly at the exposed ceiling joists. Diane clutched her designer handbag, her knuckles white, her eyes red and swollen. The deputy tapped the face of his wristwatch. He did not offer sympathy or deference to their country club status. "The clock is ticking," the deputy informed my father. "You were served with a court-ordered eviction notice. The grace period is non-existent. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather your personal toiletries and exit the premises." William blinked slowly, trying to process the command. He looked at the uniformed officer, his voice weak and trembling. "We have nowhere to go," he whispered. "Our vehicles are leased. Our accounts are overdrawn. We cannot pack an entire house in 10 minutes. You are not packing a house." The deputy corrected his tone, firm and bureaucratic. "You do not own the fixtures or the furniture. You may take clothing and basic necessities. If you are still standing on this property when my timer expires, you will be placed in handcuffs for criminal trespass. Move now." The harsh reality of the deadline broke the remaining paralysis. Diane let out a quiet sob, grabbing William by the arm. The parents who spent decades demanding perfection and obedience from their children scrambled toward the hallway like terrified refugees. They moved frantically through the dust and the debris, rushing toward the master suite to stuff whatever they could carry into a pair of canvas duffel bags. 10 minutes later, they emerged. They walked back into the gutted living room, carrying the meager remnants of their fabricated dynasty. The federal agents were busy interviewing the caterers and the contractors, ignoring the domestic departure. The wealthy guests were already slipping out the side doors, eager to distance themselves from the scandal. William and Diane walked toward the front entrance. They did not look at Mason, who was still sobbing on the floor, clutching his civil lawsuit. They possessed zero capacity to save their golden child. They were drowning, and they could only focus on their own survival. They stepped over the threshold and walked out into the humid Texas night. The flashing lights of the patrol vehicles illuminated their exit. The valets were gone. The rented sports cars were blocked by law enforcement cruisers. My parents had no transportation. They had to walk down the long, sweeping concrete driveway on foot. I stood near the entryway, watching their departure. The charcoal fabric of my trench coat caught the night breeze. I did not feel the urge to offer them a hotel room or a temporary loan. I had spent my childhood trapped in the pale blue room they designed for me, suffocating under their emotional coldness. They spent their lives building a fortress of expectations, and they had just been evicted from it. William and Diane reached the end of the driveway. They stepped through the broken, wrought iron gates, passing the severed brass padlock lying in the gravel. They walked out onto the dark shoulder of the main highway, carrying their duffel bags, disappearing into the shadows with nothing but the clothes on their backs. I turned away from the open doors. I looked at the exposed timber, the scarred concrete, and the shattered glass. The house was a ruin, but it was a clean ruin. The parasites were gone. The predators were redirected. The title was clear. I stood alone in the quiet wreckage, ready to rebuild my property on my own terms. 6 months passed since the federal raid purged the property of its parasites. The dust settled into a clean slate. I stood in the center of the Lake Travis estate, breathing in the scent of fresh paint and polished wood. The exposed timber and scarred concrete were gone. I utilized my own liquid capital to fund a legitimate architectural restoration. The contractors I hired did not require theatrical dumpsters or fake blueprints. They executed their tasks with quiet efficiency. They installed seamless floor-to-ceiling impact glass, framing the panoramic view of the water. Custom Brazilian walnut flooring replaced the shattered subflooring. The space felt light immaculate and entirely secure. I stood at the edge of the new imported marble kitchen island. A notary public and a proxy attorney representing a Silicon Valley tech executive sat across from me. We were finalizing the real estate transaction. The executive wanted a private Texas retreat, and he possessed the capital to bypass standard negotiations. I picked up a titanium pen and signed my name on the closing documents. I watched the ink dry on the paper. The signature was authentic. It was not a forgery manufactured by a desperate predator. The attorney tapped his encrypted tablet, sliding a digital confirmation across the marble surface. The international routing numbers engaged. A record-breaking 8-figure sum transferred directly into my corporate holding account. I generated a return on investment that defied standard actuarial models. I handed the brass keys to the attorney. I walked out of the front door, stepping into the warm Austin sun. I left the estate behind not as a victim of family theft, but as a victor of strategic liquidation. The transaction was complete. The architects of my exile did not experience a similar financial renaissance. The justice system and the unforgiving mechanics of American capitalism processed William and Diane with zero sentimentality. They resided in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment located in a decaying industrial park on the outskirts of the city. The physical environment served as a daily reminder of their failure. The air conditioning unit rattled constantly in the humid heat, struggling to cool the small box. Heavy commercial trucks rumbled past their single window, shaking the cheap plaster walls and filling the air with the smell of diesel exhaust. William sat at a laminate dining table, staring at a stack of overdue utility bills. His tailored golf polos were replaced by faded cotton shirts purchased from discount bins. His posture was permanently stooped. The arrogant patriarch who slammed his fist on mahogany dining tables was gone. Diane stood at the narrow kitchen counter, preparing cheap canned soup. The silence between them was toxic. They had no one left to blame for their poverty. The country club board of directors revoked their memberships the morning after the federal raid hit the local news cycle. Their elite social circle severed all ties. Wealthy influencers view association with financial fraud as a terminal disease. When Diane visited the discount grocery store, she kept her head lowered. She wore oversized sunglasses indoors, navigating the aisles with a plastic basket, terrified she might lock eyes with a former neighbor or a retired executive she used to entertain. The aristocratic pride they wielded as a weapon against me was broken. They sacrificed their dignity to protect an illusion. The illusion vanished, leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the bitter taste of regret. Their golden child discovered the true cost of his engineered naivety. Mason no longer painted abstract canvases in a climate-controlled guest house. He secured the only employment available to a man with zero marketable skills and a tarnished background. He worked at a sprawling corporate fulfillment center, built near the interstate highway. The artist traded his casual linen outfits for a rigid polyester uniform and steel-toed boots. He stood on the concrete warehouse floor under flickering fluorescent lights. The harsh electronic beep of a barcode scanner dictated the rhythm of his existence. He lifted heavy cardboard boxes, routing them onto conveyor belts for 10 hours a day. His hands grew calloused and his muscles ached with a deep, unfamiliar fatigue. A digital quota timer mounted on the wall flashed red whenever he slowed down, reminding him that he was merely a replaceable cog in a relentless logistical machine. The physical labor was brutal, but the financial reality was worse. The Dallas private equity syndicate did not forget the missing principle. Shadow lenders do not write off bad debts. They won their civil litigation lawsuit effortlessly. A county judge granted the enforcers a permanent garnishment order against Mason. Every Friday, the fulfillment center issued his paycheck. Before the funds ever reached his checking account, the syndicate extracted 70% of his gross wages to satisfy the joint liability he inherited from his husband. He worked grueling shifts just to hand his earnings over to men in sharp suits. He was paying for a stolen dream he never even got to enjoy. He would spend the next 2 decades digging himself out of a deficit he did not create. The mastermind of the fraud operated in a much smaller environment. The Department of Justice moves with lethal precision when prosecuting interstate wire fraud. Trey faced a federal judge who possessed no patience for his magnetic charisma or his tailored velvet jackets. The prosecutors traced every stolen dollar through the offshore crypto exchanges, presenting a flawless chain of evidence. Trey received a 15-year sentence in a high-security federal correctional facility. He traded his quiet luxury aesthetic for a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit. He spent his days confined to an 8-by-10-foot concrete cell. The man who thrived on manipulating high-society galas now lived in an ecosystem where his smooth vocabulary meant nothing. He tried to outsmart the financial system using my identity as a shield. The system shattered the shield and swallowed him whole. I did not stay in Texas to gloat over their ruins. True victory requires distance. I sat on the private terrace of an exclusive cliffside resort in Monaco. The crisp Mediterranean breeze pulled at the silk of my blouse. Far below, the azure water sparkled under the afternoon sun. Several luxury yachts bobbed gently in the harbor, cutting white wakes through the blue sea. The environment was a sanctuary built on undeniable, authentic wealth. I held a chilled martini in my left hand. My encrypted tablet rested on the glass table in front of me. I reviewed my diversified investment portfolio. The numbers climbed in steady, predictable arcs. My wealth was insulated. My executive license remained untouched. My actuarial firm had promoted me to senior partner following my flawless navigation of a complex corporate merger. My peace was permanently secured. I took a slow sip of the cold gin, tasting the clean, sharp finish. I watched the sun dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. The war taught me a profound lesson about the nature of survival. Bloodlines do not guarantee loyalty, and shared genetics do not entitle anyone to your resources. When parasites demand access to your sanctuary, you do not negotiate. You calculate the variables. You secure the perimeter. You let them consume themselves. The ultimate equation always balances out in the end. Those who lock the doors on their protectors will eventually find themselves sleeping outside. I lowered my martini glass onto the smooth surface of the table, listening to the faint sound of the Mediterranean waves crashing against the limestone cliffs. The war with my family was officially over. Looking back at the shattered wreckage of their fabricated dynasty, I realized that surviving their toxicity required more than just enduring the psychological pain. It demanded a fundamental shift in how I operated. The ashes of their empire left me with three undeniable truths. The first reality I accepted is that shared genetics do not entitle anyone to your resources. Society conditions us to forgive endless abuse simply because the perpetrators share our bloodline. I learned to sever that biological guilt entirely. Loyalty is a currency that must be earned through mutual respect, not extracted through manufactured obligations. When you stop funding your own disrespect and refuse to serve as the emotional sponge for a dysfunctional family, the people who only loved your utility will rapidly expose their true predatory nature. The second truth I embraced is the lethal power of absolute silence. We are often tempted to scream to demand apologies and to engage in chaotic arguments, hoping to make our abusers understand our pain. Emotional outbursts only surrender your control to the enemy. True power lies in observing quietly, gathering your data, and executing your strategy without broadcasting your intentions. I did not win this conflict by raising my voice at a crowded dinner table. I won by remaining perfectly still while my adversaries eagerly built their own cages. Finally, I learned that financial independence is the ultimate fortress. Capital is not just a tool for purchasing luxury or projecting a false image. It is a shield against coercion and the fundamental architecture of your personal autonomy. Because I controlled my own accounts and understood the cold mechanics of wealth, I could not be trapped, blackmailed, or crushed under the weight of their delusions. I protected my empire, ensuring that no one could ever strip me of my sanctuary or leverage my future. Now I spend my days analyzing global markets, closing corporate acquisitions, and enjoying the serene coastal sunsets from my private terrace. The ghosts of my past are too broke to afford a plane ticket, and the golden boy is busy folding polyester shirts for minimum wage under harsh fluorescent lights. I reclaimed my peace by letting them consume themselves. If you are currently trapped in a toxic cycle of manipulation, stop arguing and start calculating. Cut the strings and let gravity do the rest. Thank you for listening to my journey today. If this narrative resonated with your own struggles, hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned to Silent Vengeance Stories for more chronicles of survival strategy and the ultimate satisfaction of outsmarting the people who underestimated your worth.